Towards the end of my talk, I'll mention some other communities which have undertaken communal efforts in that regard, but let us not get ahead of ourselves. The topic which Rabbi Rosenblatt and I agreed upon for this evening, as you see, is a fundamental and contemporary analysis of Torah perspectives on environmental protection and climate action. I am the founder of an organization, a new one called Meisharim. Our motto is illuminating thought and priorities for Orthodox communities. And you can read the super tight mission statement there on the screen. And I can be contacted there or at rabbikornblau@gmail.com at some future time. In some fundamental way, there's not actually any particularly good reason for me, a rabbi, to be speaking with you tonight at all. The multiple overlapping crises which are facing Earth's climate and humanity and the rest of life here on Earth are exceedingly well known, exceedingly well documented, and the subject of lively discourse throughout much of the entire world at the international, national, local, individual, communal scale. There are organizations of every size and shape in this space, and ostensibly there's actually nothing for me to say. So if one, bear with me. So specifically, when I engage in these conversations, nonetheless, even though I'm not sure why I'm talking about it, I often end up giving a review of the science and the current state of reality here on the planet. That's important for many listeners because they actually don't know. I'm not saying that any of you happen to be such an individual, but it often is the case that there are fundamental debates about what's going on. And so since I have the opportunity to make this presentation by Zoom, in the past I've given most of my presentations live and on Shabbat, I can use nifty technology to show that NASA has an entire website devoted to the basic science and realities regarding this issue. I'm just letting their little windows go by. Here happens to be the video where you can literally watch the Earth get warmer as time goes by. Towards the bottom, you can watch the various items that are critical for the overall state of the climate: sea level rising, ice sheets shrinking, Arctic ice shrinking, the global temperature rising, ocean temperature, ocean salinity, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And there's more and more. There's a whole section here on the basic evidence for how we know that the climate really is changing. We have, and we know what those causes are. We know what the effects are in the real world. These are things which in the broader scientific community are individual contrarians notwithstanding, have been so widely documented, modeled. It's one of the most extraordinary efforts of modeling in all of scientific history to try to understand what's going on. Models constantly changing and being updated and made more accurate. There was a study a number of years ago that in general, scientists have been too cautious in their statements about what's going on for a whole variety of institutional reasons, quite the opposite of what people often think. But I think that I'm not going to spend time talking about that. All of these things are publicly available information. And if people have questions or comments about those sorts of things, I'm happy to take them in the question slot. So there's lots of problems and lots of potential solutions, and they're so obvious. This article struck me a number of days ago. came out a few weeks ago. There was the well-known, all over the headlines issue in the United States of United States President Biden's Build Back Better plan and its climate elements. An enormous amount of attention focused on Senator Manchin of West Virginia and his ties to coal and the entire region's ties to coal. And here, the realities are so clear in terms of the climate and the way things are rolling that the Times had an extensive article highlighting the fact that effectively Senator Manchin was siding with mine owners over mine workers, and mine workers, their whole union, effectively sided with the plan that was proposed here in the United States against the owners of their own mines. And if the coal miners know that the gig is up and that things really need to change in fundamental ways, even though they're going to take a huge personal, cultural, and everything else kind of hit. So I think that it's a kal v'chomer, it's a fortiori that all the rest of the responsible parties in the world understand just how serious things really are. Maybe one reason why I'm here is captured, though, in this graph. This is a fascinating graph which I came across a few years ago. It's based upon Pew data and other sources of data. And it's a graph which is roughly linear, as you can see, going pretty much, x equals y, just kind of a diagonal straight up across the graph. And on the bottom, we have support for the idea of evolution. So evolution is not something which really requires any support. It's the scientific foundation for the entire modern science of biology. But in cultural terms, there's a lot of debate about evolution. And so one can talk about supporting evolution from a cultural perspective. And similarly, one can talk about on the y-axis, support for environmental regulations as well. And startlingly, these topics, which really have nothing to do with each other whatsoever, turn out to have this really pretty linear correlation. There's a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But as I highlighted here, American Orthodox Jewry and the rest of world Jewry, to be honest, is in a very different place than the rest of American Jewry and the rest of world Jewry. Up on the tippy top right is the rest of American Jewry and all sorts of other people who don't have a problem with evolution and unrelatedly or relatedly, not clear, are okay and support the idea of environmental regulations. Down towards the origin point, in the big irregular shaped box I made there, you can see all the purple circles of the various evangelical denominations in the United States. They're enormous in size compared to the itsy bitsy little orange dot called the Jewish Orthodox. But there we are. We're the Jewish Orthodox, and we're a little dot in the midst of a sea of evangelicals in a very different place than the rest of world and American Jewry. And the question is, why? Why are we there? So maybe that's a reason why there's an Orthodox rabbi talking to you who's familiar with the ins and outs of our community and its history and so on. Maybe there's really a specific set of issues that need attention. And so just want to touch on my own notes here. It's curious that Orthodox Jews are, can you see my cursor moving? Can you just raise your hand?
Yes, we can see that. Yep, we can see your cursor.
You can see the cursor. So I'm going to show you that Orthodox Jews are over here in this little box, but really, according to halakha, we should be, I'm going to show you that we should really be up here. In other words, whatever our view is of evolution, which is a different topic, we should actually be way up here in terms of support for environmental regulations. And I say that because of the following kinds of sources, which I'm going to share with you. These are a series of sources taken from normative codes of Jewish law, which address the basic kinds of things that are the subject of environmental regulations. So this is not an unfamiliar topic to those who have studied the Talmud and Jewish law. And here, Maimonides has an entire multi-chapter section of his code devoted to the topic of Hilchot Shchenim, the laws of neighbors. And here, he points out that the majority of these rules are rabbinic conventions to try to sort out tensions between neighbors. And the majority of them are subject to waiving by various parties, explicit waiving, implicit waiving, and so on. However, he says that's not true with everything. And specifically, he says that 4 items, namely smoke, latrine odor, dust, and the like, and the shaking of the ground, even if a person or a group or a community or whatever the case might be, at one point waives explicitly or implicitly their claim to be bothered by such things, nonetheless, it doesn't matter. They can always object. And he writes, why can they always object to these things? On the bottom, you'll see they're different because a person's disposition will never be willing to bear these damaging activities. And we assume that he has not waived his right to protest since the damage is of an ongoing nature. So if you stop to think about smoke, intense odors of a latrine, urine and all of that, dust, meaning small particulate matter in the air, similar to smoke, and shaking of the ground. So these, particularly the smoke and the dust and the like and so on, that's actually what we have going on. We have our most massive cities, for example, in China, most notably, and other places in Asia, and as well as a number of American cities, where the issues of just plain old air pollution are highly consequential to human life. When the Australian fires were burning about 2 years ago, I guess it is at this point, the smoke, et cetera, that was caused by all of those things darkened the atmosphere of major cities in Australia and far beyond, due to the way that the winds transferred those items all over the place. So this type of a source alone suggests that we in halakha, in Jewish law, have not the slightest problem regulating these things. We pay no mind to any person's individual preferences, and instead we assume that everyone's bothered by these things and we regulate away. Similarly, writing about the similar passages in the Talmud, which are found in the tractate called Bava Batra, in the chapter called Lo Yachpor, some famous Rishonim, some medieval commentaries elaborate on what is behind all of this rabbinic legislation. So one of them, named the Yad Ramah, writes in a general way that there's a prohibition to cause an act which will damage people. Asir lemigram midi de'ati dine hezeka le'inshi. And he suggests 2 possible biblical bases for this. One is the prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein michshol, that you're not allowed to place literally a stumbling block before the blind. Namely, you're putting something in front of an object, in front of another person, and you're messing with them. That's not the usual halachic Jewish law interpretation of that verse, but here he's interpreting it very literally. So that's one possible source of all of these Talmudic laws. And the other one, he says, is simply the duty to love our fellows. Narrowly in halakha, this is typically construed as love of our fellow Jews. But obviously the idea of brotherly love extending beyond our people and between all people is surely an ideal that we all can hang on to. And we can see that no one wants this kind of stuff happening to them. And it's a manifestation of love to make sure that we don't do it to others. Another even more well-known medieval commentator named the Rosh, one of the primary bridges between medieval Ashkenaz and medieval Sfard in Spain, and one of the primary sources of Jewish law in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Law, and so on. He also writes about the many rabbinic laws relating to damages that individuals can inflict upon one another. And he writes that, look, the Mishnah and the Talmud give specific rules when it comes to specific things where in the estimation of the rabbinic sages, they were able to determine that if you move the source of bothersomeness, that's not a good word, away, then move it that distance, and that's good enough. But if they couldn't figure it out, then they simply specified vehecha she'en yadua. But if they weren't able to figure out precisely how far to distance the damage, then katvu bichdei shelo yazik. They said you just have to move it far away enough that you don't bother other individuals. And he goes on to explain the third cause for all of these laws, namely darchei noam, that every time we put the Torah back in the ark on the Sabbath morning, and other times we sing Darchei Noam B'chol Netivotei Shalom, that the Torah's ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its ways are peace, and paths are peace. And so even with your own property, you can't do things that bother others because it's unpleasant. It's not Darchei Noam. It's an unneighborly way to act. And so for these reasons, to extrapolate to the broad circumstances we have now on planet Earth, where we're all doing stuff which is effectively bothering everybody else, we're messing with them by putting a stumbling block before them. We are showing our disinterest in them and or our lack of love for them. And we're certainly not acting in pleasant ways to the extent that we, as not necessarily to a certain extent as individuals, certainly as collectives, and certainly as nations and as humanity as a whole, are doing things to damage the environment, and with it damage people and whole countries and all of that. There's one scholar who recently came up with a new idea. I say new because Orthodox rabbis, since Samson Raphael Hirsch in the modern period, through Rabbi Kook, through Rabbi Soloveitchik, through the early Zionists, writers, and into the contemporary period, Rabbi Lamb, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and a whole slew of Rabbi Sachs, and a whole slew of lesser known figures, including numerous religious Zionist rabbis in the state of Israel right now, have written a lot about these topics. And I say new because in all of those writings, this passage from the Talmud is only recently surfaced in an article that was published a few years ago. And this passage is talking about the fuel for the altar in the temple. And the Mishnah rules that you're not allowed to use olive trees and wine vines, grapevines, to use as wood for to burn on the altar. And the Talmud tries to figure out why. So the first answer is that the olive branches have thick knots, and the effect of that is that they produce excessive smoke. So that we have a local problem. We have a smoking problem. If you've ever had a fire that over smokes, it's very unpleasant. You don't want that in the temple courtyard. You don't want that going out into the rest of Jerusalem and so on. So that's the first reason which is given. The second reason is much more comprehensive. The second reason which the Talmud offers is Mishum Yishuv de Eretz Yisrael. It's because that what you're doing is you're depleting the olive trees and grapevines, and the effect of that is that you just gobble them all up, because the altar would be able to burn them away much more quickly, because it had to have the fires constantly going, than Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, could possibly sustain. And the net effect is that you have less trees, less vines, and in the end, it's not sustainable. And so here, fascinatingly, you have a passage in the Talmud where ecological sustainability for a region, in this particular case, Eretz Yisrael, is the source for prohibiting the not only in general, but the incredibly central mitzvah of keeping the fire on the altar burning. It's a no-go if it's not going to be sustainable. And here we have a very early source that's aware of the broad consequences of if you burn one olive tree, it doesn't matter. If you burn 2 olive trees, it doesn't matter. But if you keep on going, the cumulative effect of all the individual actions add up. And that's exactly the situation which, broadly speaking, we're in nowadays, where our atmosphere and all the other woes, which the biosphere, all of that which supports life on air, land, and sea, and all of its multiple processes, where all of life in the universe exists, all of that is being degraded by precisely this sort of hacking away. It's one thing at a time. It's one puff of carbon dioxide here, one puff of methane over there, one act here, one act there. And no one act gets the job done, but the effect is of all of them taking place over time is what causes the problem. And so what here in the Talmud is a local issue to Eretz Yisrael, we're experiencing now on a global issue, given the changes since those days. These ideas and many others, there are many other areas of law which I could and should be citing now. I could quote a statement which was recently put out by a number of religious Zionist rabbis in advance of Prime Minister Bennett's participation in the Glasgow conference this fall, which I translated and had published in a variety of, which Meisharim had translated and published in Orthodox publications throughout the United States, where they referred to the current crisis as pikuach nefesh olami, that what we have here is a threat to human life at the global scale. And they urged Prime Minister Bennett to take it seriously on behalf of Israel, because Mitzion Tetei Torah Dvar Hashem Yerushalayim, the country which is the origin, and the faith which is the origin point of the religions of billions of people on planet Earth, the eyes of the world are upon us, not only for what we do as individuals, but for what we stand for as a faith community representing God in the world. And I could quote other ideas. A traditional topic in this area is Bal Tashchit, the prohibition mentioned in the book of Deuteronomy, not to destroy fruit trees during warfare. A lot of conversation in environmental sources around that. But the upshot is that whether in formal halacha, in Jewish law, or in general Jewish thought, or as a general mode of existence, the prohibition of Bal Tashchit, of not destroying things unless there's a highly constructive purpose for doing so, is foundational to halacha, particularly the worldview of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, one of the foundational thinkers of modern Orthodox thought in the contemporary period, and many others. And one of the classic examples of Bal Tashchit is given by the Sefer HaChinuch, a medieval summary of all of the 613 commandments according to the Talmud, the Maimonides enumeration of the commandments. And in it, he explains that he thinks the whole gist of the commandment is that people who are bad people are unconcerned about the destruction of the world, and people who are good, pious people, they worry about the destruction of anything, even, he writes, a single mustard seed, using as his example the destruction of even small amounts of food. Of course, you're going to use every bit of food that you have. How could you possibly waste such a thing? And we'll see the important role of food waste in a moment. So I could go on and mention a bunch of other ideas, the idea of being careful about damages to the public, the idea of urban planning law, the idea of chamira sakanta mi'isur, the idea that halacha, Jewish law, is much stricter with things that pertain to danger, public danger, individual danger, and so on, than it is even regarding ordinary prohibitions, which when one looks in the codes and see the sorts of things which are prohibited, and the kinds of things some of which we still adhere to, and the known damages which many of our actions collectively make nowadays, it's easy to see how those things would apply. But in my short slot, I want to change gears altogether and figure out why we are over here. Why, if I could keep on going and quote all these terrific sources, why halacha and our classic sources should care about it, why in fact is our dot over here when it should be up over here? it's really not hard to make the case. Why aren't we up way over here? And so for that, I'd like to share with you this list, which I've accumulated from research as well as my own experience, reading, and so on, that seem to be over-determine, shall we say, Orthodoxy's position on that slot. And I've broken them into 4 different areas. One are historical, cultural factors, and you can see the 4 categories here, and I'll run through them very quickly. Our people culturally has been in exile without a land and the responsibilities of having a land for 2,000 years. And the effect of that is that sensibility is lost from most Jews, particularly in the Orthodox community, because it's not something that we do. In theory, we have Jewish law that covers all of a way of life, but in practice, it's been diminished by our diaspora experience for so long. And that diaspora experience also featured governments which beat us up for a long time. If I were to click on this little blue thing here, I'm not going to do it, then it would take us to the song from Fiddler on the Roof, where the rabbi gives a blessing to the czar, telling the czar that God should keep the czar and bless the czar and keep him very far away from us. And that fundamental attitude towards government persists in the Orthodox community. Another aspect of Orthodoxy is that culturally, and our largest community still to this day, historically, are urban. And being urban means that you are disconnected from the natural world. I remember for many years when I was working at Goldman Sachs, as Rabbi Rosenblatt mentioned, I lived in Manhattan with my wife. And even in those days, many decades ago, the sense of just being utterly cut off from trees and the natural world was extremely marked. And many of our largest Orthodox communities are similarly disconnected. And not all of them, but even the ones that are somewhat connected tend to pay little heed to the natural world around them. We also culturally eat a lot of meat, and the consumption of meat, in case you don't know already, is a major driver of carbon dioxide output as well as methane output when one backs all the way up to the pasture lands which are required for the cows, the life of the cows, the slaughtering of the cows, and everything, and the lamb and everything else that goes into it. And so we have these historical cultural things which really have no root in halakha particularly at all, but they're part of our Orthodox legacy. We also have demographic factors. We're a small number of people in total, and Orthodox Jews regularly mention that it doesn't matter what we do or what we say. The world's population, we all together, we make up such a tiny percentage of the world's population that it just doesn't matter. And I don't think that's a good way to think. That's assuming that other people are going to try to solve the problem is what everybody does. We don't have to worry about it in the United States because the problem is in China. And I once spoke to someone who spoke to people on the Tibetan highlands that she was trying to convince them to stop doing something which was burning dung, which was dumping ash onto their glaciers and melting their own glaciers and ruining their own way of life. And their response was accurately, you're telling us that we have to worry about burning dung and darkening our glaciers and accelerating their melting. The real reason why they're melting is because the entire Western civilization dumped all this methane and carbon dioxide into the world, and you want us to change? So that's exactly what everybody says all around the world. It's always somebody else's problem, and that's not the way it's going to have to roll in terms of the long family. What are other demographic factors? We have high birth rates. Population control is a very touchy topic in general. It lurks around the sides of environmental discourse, and just the mere idea of it typically blows up and agitates Orthodox Jewry. We're extremely sensitive to the loss of 1/3 of our people just within living memory, and to the ongoing assimilation of so many. The idea that we're going to stop making Jewish babies is simply anathema culturally and to a certain extent halakhically, religiously. Notably, one earlier writer about the environment took this on in a book called Challenge, In the early 1970s, Rabbi Ari Carmel, who was one of the founders of the Orthodox Society Association for Jewish Scientists, and he thought that, at least in principle, it was okay to advocate for some degree of encouraging less babies for Gentiles, even though he didn't think that worked for Jews. But be that as it may, that's a big issue in our community, and it often comes up when Orthodox Jews talk about it. Another is large families, cramped living quarters, to a certain extent, poor conditions for some of our co-religionists in the Orthodox community. All of this creates significant reliance on disposable plastic food service items. Our communal kiddushes and so on often do as well. The creation of those items itself consumes fossil fuels, and their waste products go into the ocean and make pollution, which is not directly climate change, but is still a deep stress on the world's oceans and beyond. Unsurprisingly, if you're going to make me change anything, so no one wants to change anything, and so Orthodox Jews are no different, and they prefer to avoid the whole topic, and that's commonly what happens. There are political factors as well. I'm sure many of you have read them by now, and for culturally and politically, Orthodox Jews are often on the conservative side. Its primary media and internally and externally media sources tilt heavily towards a conservative worldview. And the upshot of that is that those sources of news and information often downplay the actual realities of what's going on in the world. They either don't talk about it or present inaccurate information about it. And additionally, environmental activity has long been associated with political liberals. And there are certainly very radical people in the environmental world who think of humans as fundamentally the problem. We need to get rid of all the people and let all the animals and trees thrive and just get rid of people. And so if you turn that into your bogeyman and you declare that that's what regular people who are concerned about the environment think, then you can dismiss with the straw man arguments all concern for the environment. And indeed, that sort of argumentation happens as well. Israel's poor treatment of the United Nations and in other international venues seems irrelevant, but the largest body, the IPCC, which is the organization of all of the large international scientific bodies of the entire planet, is closely connected to the UN, and according to the IPCC, simply in the eyes of many Orthodox Jews, reminds them of the United Nations, which reminds them of all sorts of bad things, and so they turn it off. Finally, there is theological issues, and I've listed them here. Broadly speaking, your standard Orthodox Jew is focused on his spiritual world, faith and trust in Hashem, in God, experience his presence in this world, and more importantly, in the next. His hashgacha, his providential care for us as individuals and for the world in general. There's a Kabbalistic belief called theurgy, which means that if one performs various precepts of the Torah, that one fixes problem in the heavenly realms. That's part of the reason why Lubavitcher Hasids are so enthusiastic about getting Jews to perform specific ritual mitzvot with their vans and cars and things like that, because they're not just doing a mitzvah, you're helping to solve a problem up in the heavenly spheres. But all of that energy focuses us away from this world, and it focuses us on a different kind of a world. Running through the rest, environmental problems, as I started out with, they're universal. They're not particular to the Jewish people or Orthodox Jews, although obviously our sources easily speak about them from multiple perspectives. Additionally, non-Orthodox Jews and non-Orthodox denominations often are in fact, often use the idea of tikkun olam, trying to repair the world, as an agenda item. People who are knowledgeable about Jewish sources know easily how to push back at that idea and think, no, that's not a this worldly idea, that's a theological idea. It's also a narrowly construed idea in the Mishnayot, in the Mishnah in Tractate Gittin. And so they swipe back at the very concept of tikkun olam, and they bridle at the unfamiliar use of what they consider to be their holy texts. At the beginning, I mentioned the issue of evolution, and indeed, some in the Orthodox community have ongoing issues regarding science and religious concerns. The debate about Rabbi Natan Slifkin's book and his worldview, I cited here his famous book, talks about these issues at considerable length. And finally, the Bible itself sounds like God's never going to let the earth falter. He's never going to upset the seasons or let it be flooded. And this isn't the time to refute those ways of understanding things, but suffice to say that the blank citation of verses without interpretive context and nuance is, the devil can quote scripture, and so can people who are opposed to environmental causes, just like people who are in favor of environmental causes. So, but these are the factors which experience and study has shown typically drive what goes on. How do we move forward? Happily, there are lots of reasons and ways to move forward. The first and the best thing that's going on in the United States is a successor to an organization for which I used to work. The first Orthodox organization focused on the environment was called Kanfei Nesharim, organized by Ivan Marzuk, who currently works at the environment, who for a long time has worked in the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as Ora Scheinsen. And they did a great job putting together texts and ideas revolving from an Orthodox perspective, revolving around science and Torah and the like. Ultimately, a new generation came along, and a younger group of people has emerged itself, has absorbed the world of Kanfei Nesharim, made a new organization called Grow Torah, and Grow Torah is, Baruch Hashem, growing. It's run by two wonderful young people in their 20s and 30s, and that's characteristic of environmental issues. Young people care about it across the board, even in conservative religious groups, much more than older people. They realize that it's their planet and their future, and it matters a lot. And Grow Torah has its gardens and its camp activities in multiple modern Orthodox schools and some not so modern Orthodox schools throughout the New York metropolitan area and beyond. It's expanding with leaps and bounds. And if you are not in touch with them, I encourage you to do so. Explore their resources, sign up for their emails, follow their Torah, and bring them to your community in schools and beyond. Another thing that we can do is just do the things that everybody needs to do. So there's on the web, there's a book published by an entity called Project Drawdown, and they highlight that 90% of excess global emissions of greenhouse gases are caused by people in high-income countries, meaning that's us, everybody here on the phone. We're a minority of the people, and we are a majority of the cause. And the question that I'm always asked is, what can I do as an individual? And the answer is, here's a list. Figure out how in your kitchen to eliminate as much food waste as possible. When you trace back all of the resources that are devoted to creating that food and getting it to you, and then you throw out the tomato because it just doesn't cook, because you don't like it very much. So you effectively threw out a lot. You effectively just discarded a whole lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere by not consuming it. And one can multiply that endlessly. Replacing as much of your meat in general and red meat in particular with more vegetables and protein-rich plants is easy to do. It's healthy, it's cheap, and it's not a problem. I'm not calling for people to become vegans or vegetarians, although a lot of people do that. I don't do that. I just had chicken for dinner. But we have dramatically changed, and everyone can dramatically reduce the amount of meat one step at a time, and slowly you get there. That's wholly in the hands of individual consumers and kitchens, and something we need to do. The other items that are here, updating to renewable energy in your homes, and I would say, and your businesses, and your shuls, and your schools, and your institutions. So a paper that I'm publishing shortly has a list of a number of Orthodox synagogues and schools around the United States and beyond who have installed solar panels and done other such things. And we can do all of those things and more in our Jewish communities, exactly like you folks in Vancouver are doing. And I applaud you from a distance. Insulate your home. Big deal. You're just throwing money and heating fuel right out your uninsulated home throughout the cold and hot seasons. The switch to LED lights you see, smart thermostats. I already mentioned about solar panels and solar hot water. The issue of electric and hybrid vehicles are all over the news. You shouldn't necessarily discard your existing car, but you should use it much less. And the next time use those. But even there, electric and hybrid vehicles have their own world of problems because simply creating them, I can't talk about it now, but it's not a great solution, but it's better than what we currently have. In general, travel less, have more Zooms, fly less. I don't cut out all flying. I fly places, but I'm very careful. And I encourage everyone to be very careful about the places they go and what are their motives and can it be really exchanged with something else. And finally, the familiar 4 R's. There used to be 3, now there's 4. Refuse, simply have less stuff. Reduce, the stuff you have and share it with other people. Reuse the stuff that you have in creative ways. And finally, when you get to the bottom of it, try to recycle, avoiding the single-use plastic. Recycle correctly. That's not always so easy. My wife is always correcting me on recycling. But these are the bottom scraper things to do. The most important thing to do is just simply to consume less across the board. Here are 2 other great things to do. One of my colleagues, Rabbi Yechiel Schaefer, and a colleague of his, Ari Middleman, are having a Zoom on February 7th to help make synagogues and schools more energy efficient by using federal funds and grant opportunities that are available for this. The OU just did a bang-up job of getting in the United States, of getting federal funding to be available for religious institutions as well. And I'm sure they'll be rolling out a program soon to help synagogues and schools, et cetera, take advantage of those things so that we can have more green institutions. And with it, hopefully publicizing those things will transmit into the lives of individuals as well. In Great Britain, there's the Synagogue Initiative. About 2 or 3 dozen synagogues, including more than a dozen Orthodox ones, have come together to do what they refer to as an energy audit, and not only of their institutional buildings, but of all the practices that take place in those buildings, as well as the practices of their individual members. And that's a great initiative. Perhaps you folks in Vancouver can reach out to the folks in Great Britain and Synagogue and try to not reinvent the wheel and take advantage of some of the expertise they have. And so on and so forth. The last thing that I want to talk about is what's at the top here, which is that, in my view, it's not really about halacha. It's not really about all these other cultural things that I've mentioned. It's not really about even the practical things, because once you care, then you end up doing all the practical things. And the question is, how do you get people to care? Well, here I've listed a bunch of teachings from a variety of teachers and sources, all of which are designed to encourage Orthodox Jews to care. The first is a Mishnah Masechet in Tractate Rosh Hashanah, which says that in Rosh Hashanah, God judges all members of the world as a flock. And thinking of ourselves as a member of the flock of humanity is so natural to us now in the pandemic, and it's obviously true with respect to environmental issues as well. And so we have to ask ourselves, are we doing our job as a member of God's human flock? That's the Jewish duty, it's a universal duty, and something that we really need to do. There's a famous passage in the Talmud about a fellow named Choni HaMa'agel. Choni wakes up from a long sleep, and he discovers there's an old man planting a carob tree that he's never going to see the fruit of. And he says, "My hi, why are you doing that?" And the old man explains, "I found a world filled with carob trees, and I need to leave one that my ancestors created, and now I need to do the same. And that basic sense of intergenerational commitment and caring, not just for our own personal things, but planning for the future, that's at the core of what it means to have an environmental consciousness. One could go on. One of my colleagues, Rabbi Tzvi Sinensky, has noted that the idea of derech eretz kadma l'Torah, the way of the world precedes the Torah, is a type of natural law. It includes many things in rabbinic thought. And those things are just, in effect, what it means to be a good citizen of the world, a good citizen of our country. And if good manners and marital relations and all sorts of other things can be included in the way of the world, so things that are literally related to the actual eretz, the actual aretz, the actual earth that we live on, surely can be included there as well. Rav Kook has a beautiful song, poem, where he talks about individuals who sing the song of their soul, others who also sing the song of their nation, others who sing the song of humanity, and yet others who sing the song of all of creation, and finally those who sew all of those songs into a single symphony of all. And to me, that's one of the most inspiring teachings possible, to remember that we're part of a big wide world, and to not focus merely on ourselves, but everyone around. Rabbi Soloveitchik has a startling teaching. Rabbi Stacks has a well-discussed stewardship paradigm, and he makes other claims as well. Listen, I could keep on talking about this for a long time. I'm going to stop. I hope that that's been some food for thought, and I look forward to questions.
The way that I would like to handle questions is, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat to everyone, or you can send it directly to me in the chat on this. So, Rabbi Kornblau, okay. All right. A question from Josh Hauser, which is the following. The overall analysis, not about individual action, but about choosing government religion, neglect the other side of the ledger. For example, consider Steven Pinker. What if by polluting to some level we succeed in feeding the hungry around the world, right? So that in terms of, a lot of the internal combustion engine, I think, if I'm interpreting Josh's question correctly, the internal combustion engine has contributed a lot to global warming, but yet at the same time, the internal combustion engine is responsible for a lot of progress. So how do you see halacha balancing those two things? Is there a weighted argument to those kinds of advantages to humanity, while at the same time taking into account some of these questions?
There are numerous answers to that, but I think that the coal miners of America perhaps provide the simplest answer, which is that they themselves understand that their emissions are causing so much damage they have to put themselves out of business. I don't know what to say. There comes a time when the threat to humanity as a whole is so large that the urgency of action is critical. Listen, William Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize within the past few years, an economist at Yale, for trying to teach economists how to incorporate into modern economic theory, capitalist modern economic theory, the issue of the externalities of pollution and other things which happen due to industrial processes. And that his thinking has been since supplanted by others. But ultimately, there's a lot of, shall we say, things that are consumed that really don't need to be consumed by any reasonable standard. And Professor Pinker and other techno-optimists and so on, notwithstanding, we can talk about the world improving in many ways, but those improvements simply don't offset the ongoing damage and the need to attend to it urgently. What we have is, as another prominent intellectual put it in one of his books, Malcolm Gadwell, yeah, called Tipping Points. So he wrote about his tipping points, but at this point, we are approaching and have already triggered multiple tipping points in the Earth's climate, which are essentially irreversible. At this point, the heating of the northern regions of the planet is so intense that there are fires in Siberia, which in turn melt the permafrost, which in turn release methane, which has been locked in that permafrost, which in turn create more global warming, which creates more heating, which creates more melting. And those changes are, and that's just one of the cycles, and there are many others as well. So talking about trade-offs and things, it's fine. I'm not calling for the closing of the entire community. I don't think anybody should be, but no, it's apples and oranges to a certain extent.
So moving on to another question. And I encourage questions, if you will, a little bit more about the Torah thought on this. And I think Josh's question was on point, because the question really is, how do we balance those questions about human progress and environmentalism?
Now, I'm reminded of the beginning of the pandemic. There was a false claim that we have to choose between reigning in the pandemic and working on the economy. And it turned out that was bogus. The way to solve both problems at once was to address the pandemic, because until you address the pandemic, there wasn't going to be an economy. And we saw the enormous fluctuations in the economy at that time. And eventually that was what was needed, because, and so we see the same thing here. In my view, it's essentially a false choice. It's not a matter of whether we should have an economy, but what the economy should look like and what it should be doing and how it should be functioning, not whether or not we should exist and whether we should buy and trade things, but what should we buy and how should we buy and so on.
So moving on to a complete, might be a completely different area, is how do you put Shemitah into this entire picture, the seventh sabbatical year? Is that an element of? Is it a model for environmental activism? Is it itself have anything to do with this conversation, or is the fact that it's a mitzvah of restraint in the land really the only thing that it shares?
Shemitah is a great mitzvah. A number of years ago, I gave a whole series of shiurim on all the halachot and yesodot of Hilchot Shemitah. It's a wonderful topic. It's a topic which is of tremendous consequence in Israel right now. It is currently a Shemitah sabbatical year. And as Mizrahi in its recent publication has pointed out, people in Israel have tried to figure out how to take the agrarian ideals of Shemitah, which in one sense are a set of formal agricultural laws, and turn them into a sort of ethos to focus on in a variety of practical ways among Jews there. Others have quoted Rav Kook's ecstatic vision of the sabbatical and jubilee laws in the introduction to his book Shabbat Haaretz as being rather remarkable visions for society. I think all of these things are great. I think that for most Jews living in the diaspora, practically speaking, it just doesn't make much sense. And I'm speaking to diaspora Jews. What made sense what makes sense in a Zionist Israel context, in my view, calling for it in the United States is pretty much doesn't make much sense.
I'm going to take the liberty to ask a question of my own. Are there any major Torah figures, contemporary Torah figures in the yeshiva world, any heads of a yeshiva who are making this a significant issue, who have issued piskei halakha, official decisions of law on this matter?
My forthcoming paper has an extensive discussion about what it would mean to make halachic rulings about all these matters. And the answer is, it's not so easy. The result of that is that the organization which I'm founding, called Misharim, has as its one of its initial projects a careful formulation of questions for individual poskim, which we plan to present to them over time. in order to elicit from them the kinds of concerns that we anticipate that they're likely to say, and that they might surprise us and say more. And there are a number who talk about it all the time. Rav Tzvi Rimon, who's currently the chief rabbi of Gush Etzion area, talks about it all the time. The religious Zionist rabbis that I mentioned earlier on, who signed the Kol Koreh, the statement to Prime Minister Bennett, include Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, who else signed on? David Stav, and a number of other prominent Israeli rabbis have spoken about it. That discourse has not really reached the United States very much, and I'm hoping for that people will support my organization so that we can get that discourse brought over to the U.S. and to good effect, and among American poskim as well.
Okay. Question is, how do you see the relationship between Mashiach and the environment? Will Mashiach solve the environment, or is that backwards? Is our fixing of the environmental problem part of our responsibility, or, if you believe in such things, the hastening of the coming of Mashiach? I know in the Christian community, there is a very strong sense that God won't let this get too far out of hand. What do you think the Torah's position on this is? Do we assume that God will save us from our own mistakes, or and send Mashiach or something like that, or maybe put that all together for us?
There are a lot of moving parts in there, but to answer your last question first, Rabbi Sachs a number of years ago addressed the Lambeth Conference, and that recording is available online. If you Google Rabbi Sachs Lambeth Conference, you can listen to Rabbi Sachs Zatzal, and you can read his words. And in it, he gives his reading of the story of Noah in chapter 9 of the book of Genesis, and the rainbow and the covenant and all of that. A source which seems to suggest that God's never going to let anything bad happen to the world again. And there are many approaches to that text, but his is, I think, the most direct of all, and perhaps the most straightforward, which is, I gave you a world. I'm not going to destroy it, but you folks have free will, and you are powerful, and you will, under my guidance, develop technology and knowledge and collective wisdom, which is going to let you destroy or not destroy the world. The Midrash already has an understanding that already in Gan Eden, there was the possibility of them destroying the Garden of Eden in Kohelet Rabbah. And Rabbi Sachs doesn't flinch from it. He says, human beings were given free will, they can do whatever they want. And that includes destroying things, and God isn't going to stop them. There are many other approaches to that text, including Talmudic and others. Regarding the Messiah, I'm not sure exactly what the Messiah is doing in here, but the Messiah is one of my first and favorite topics in Jewish thought. Suffice to say that, broadly speaking, there are two broad schools of messianic thought for our purposes here. One is effectively that the world to come in the Messiah is effectively utterly unlike the current world. And the other one is the view of Shmuel in the Talmud. Ein bein olam hazeh u'olam haba ela shibud malchuyot bilvad. The only difference between the world to come and our world is that the Jews will no longer be politically oppressed, and but meaning otherwise, the world keeps on going. Natural law continues to go, and the trees are still going to have apples, and the apples are still going to fall, and they're still going to hit Newton on the head. And all of the laws of physics which govern the earth are going to keep on going. There's not going to be any magic in the Messiah. There's not going to be any magic in the Messianic world. And as a result, the Messianic conversation just isn't relevant. If fundamentally you think of religion, our faith as taking us beyond this world, I already flagged that as one of the problems that Orthodox thought has in focusing on the current world and its current present woes.
Okay. So just before we conclude, there was a request that if you wouldn't mind posting the best contact information for yourself in the chat, or for the Mesharim organization. Okay, so fantastic. Rabbi Kornblau, we want to thank you very much for this. If anyone enjoyed this and wants to go back to various parts of it, we hope it'll be up on our YouTube channel, and it'll be available on our website in the next couple days, hopefully before Shabbos. And Rabbi Kornblau, I want to thank you for presenting tonight. You even drew a couple of other rabbis from around the world, even from red states. So I would tell you that obviously a word of this lecture got out, and we're very grateful to you for presenting to us this evening.
It was great hearing from you this summer, and I'm glad that our conversation then came to fruition now. And I hope that Vancouver's Jewish community goes Lamala, keeps on going better and better in all of its denominations and beyond. Jews and non-Jews and everybody, we all got to do our thing and try to go into the different resources that I shared, and let's do it, folks.
Well, Barry, we have a special incentive here because people in Vancouver love skiing and whistling, and if it gets too warm, we're not one of those places like Colorado where it's incredibly high and incredibly cold. So we want to make sure that things stay just at that Goldilocks temperature.
I apologize. I literally either didn't hear or didn't understand you. I have a feeling you were trying to be witty, but I didn't hear it.
Oh, no, I was just saying that the snow in Whistler Mountain, where we like to ski, is in that comfortable zone. It's not like Colorado where it's minus 25. We ski minus 6 or so, Celsius, that is. So we have a special incentive to keep those temperatures down.
I see. Okie dokie. I got it.
Get it while you can, Rabbi.
I understand now. Okay.
Okay. Anyway, thank you so much.
Because of my concern about physical danger, I stopped skiing a long time ago. The risk for someone 6'2" of falling or hurting myself is just much too large. I have a family and other things I got to take care of. Not worth it.
At least come for a visit. At least come for a visit.
Oh, so I'd have to fly. You'd have to give me a nice mitzvah to come on out.
Who said you had to fly?
All right, I'll walk. Fine.
All right. Shabbat shalom to you, and thanks again.
Shabbat shalom, and thank you.
Thank you very much.